appreciate the opportunity to come here today and speak at a conference that's focused on finance and trade. DNV being primarily an organization engaged in technical work. You know, it's a refreshing change to be in the company of such esteemed people here today and to be talking on something a little bit different compared to what we normally talk about. So I hope to give you a bit of a different angle on this from a class society perspective. I shall try to fulfill the high expectations that have been placed upon class in the earlier session as well. I think it was Sohar Port, Emil mentioned this morning about an anniversary, 20 years, congratulations by the way, on that milestone. DNV this year is also celebrating an anniversary, 160 years, so a little bit older than Sohar Port. And so what are class societies? Essentially class societies are knowledge hubs. You know, we build up knowledge and experience over all these years. And I think we see that the role is changing from the traditional classification, technical verification role to more of an advisor. And I think this is particularly important as we face all these challenges ahead of us. You know, that class can be a one-stop shop for coming out, helping you find solutions to all these increasing challenges ahead of you. Just to recap on where we are, what state we're in, where we're heading. So you have three main drivers of decarbonization and sustainability in shipping. Of course, it's the regulations, but it's increasingly the customer expectations, and perhaps more importantly for this conference, the access to finance and capital. What we've seen in recent times with, for example, the establishment of the Poseidon Principles a number of years ago is that financial institutions are actually leading the way. You recall that the Poseidon Principles were established because people felt that the regulators were not being strict enough, were not progressing enough. So the banks collectively came together and formed this alliance and the principles, as you know, and we can get back to that, of course. So I think what we've seen is this very proactive approach, particularly among European and Western investors that collectively represent around 50% of the global trading fleet. And their targets, of course, align with the IMO trajectory or even surpass it in some cases. So everyone's actively participating in the ESG agendas, as we've heard earlier. I won't spend too much time on this. I'm sure you're well aware of the Poseidon Principles and who's part of that. It's 34 banks now that have signed on to this. All the Western banks, but also now a number of Japanese banks. Collectively, they represent around 80% of all ship financing, so this is substantial. And so what are the key aspects of the Poseidon Principles? Well, it's three things. It's about awareness. So it's about raising awareness of the greenhouse gas impact of the lending institutions. It's about having some annual improvement targets in place. And then it's about demonstrating a commitment to supporting the transition to net zero. You can say that the ship financing, you have a kind of carrot and stick approach. And the Poseidon Principles, they're the stick approach. They're the kind of regulatory side of the finance environment. So then moving on, let's talk a little bit about sustainable finance. The graph here shows the total global sustainable finance over the years and how that's developed. And of course, you can see a steep increase in 2021, a slight reduction the last 2 years due to various geopolitical reasons, etc. It doesn't really show you the true picture, though, because the actual total issuance of finance products in these 2 years also reduced. So what we see, in fact, and I haven't shown it here, is that the proportion of green bonds as a total of the total bonds issued globally is now increased year by year, and it's around 16% of the totality. So then when it comes to shipping, I've got a few examples here of companies that have taken the green financing route. What are the prospects for owners? Well, in essence, the ESG lending has a lower risk profile than conventional lending. So what this does is it opens up to the owners a greater variety and a greater choice of funding for their projects. In addition to that, of course, it gives them favorable loan terms. For the bonds, it's typically 50 base points less interest, so 0.5% less interest. For conventional loans and debt, it's around 10 basis points, around 0.1%. So the owners get more choice. and the owners get more favourable terms on their loans, in addition to the benefits that they have of having a greener vessel in terms of the lower taxation due to the lower carbon emissions. What are the key criteria for these owners to qualify for green financing? It's not just about it being a little bit better than average. The projects, the vessels, they have to be really green. And typically these finance products, they don't apply to vessels that are engaged in the shipment of fossil fuels, because that kind of goes a little bit against the objective of the decarbonisation. So we're talking about really green vessels, maybe zero emission in some cases, very low emission, trying out alternative, low carbon fuels. This part of the world, we've had some discussions earlier about, the uptake in this part of the world. We have some players on the right here who have a foot in the region. Hapag-Lloyd, many of you know. They've had totally 10 projects over the past few years where DNV has also supported them in documenting their footprint. So they've been very successful in this area, and of course they have a foot still in the region. And Densay Shipping, present in Dubai, also in Turkey. I think they have the 4th vessel being delivered now with green financing with very favourable terms, and where DNV has also helped. So it's relevant for this region, and I think increasingly so. So you might ask then, what is the DNV, or what is the class role in all of this? I'll talk about 3 different elements. So first of all, on the Poseidon Principles. It's necessary to report on the assets, so there's a job to be done in terms of data collection, processing and reporting, and then performing advanced analytics to predict where the ship will be and how the ship is likely to comply with the decarbonisation trajectory in the future. Then on the financial institutions, we act as an advisor on around 14 banks. We're kind of the go-to place for most of the Western banks when it comes to helping them with their decarbonisation strategies, helping to understand how things are evolving, what technologies, and what is really green. Again, a lot of it is about data collection, analysis and planning, but also about advice on future strategies. And then the third one, last but not least, on the ship owners. We support them in them getting access to green financing by doing gap assessments, so an informal assessment on their project to evaluate its environmental performance. We give them feedback on any gaps. Once they adapt and modify their proposal and their project, we perform what is more formal assessment. It's called a second party opinion, an SPO. So that's done by a different business area within DNV, so as to maintain the impartiality. So that's a certificate that the owner will then take to the lending institutions to enable them to get access to the favourable green financing products. So a little bit about the track record that we have here. DNV delivers around 50% of the Poseidon Principle reporting globally. As I said earlier, we work with around 14, 15 banking clients to advise them on strategies, and we also have more than a third, with the biggest there, on the issuance of SPSOs for owners. And collectively, our activities touch around 5,000 vessels in the global fleet every year. It's still a small part of our business. I mean, it's of course small compared to the traditional class role, but it's a growing an increasingly important role that we play, especially to the owners that are engaged in this area. Now, moving on a little bit to emissions, and that's the core of all of this, isn't it? Emissions is becoming business critical, so it's not only about compliance, but it impacts your performance beyond the conventional fuel consumption and fuel cost. So as we see, financial institutions are using emissions in how they assess the risk and pricing of their products. Greenhouse gas emissions now have a cost. Yeah, from January 2024, this year now, EU ETS was implemented in a phased approach over the next 3 years. So from January 1st, your voyages in and out of EU or within the EU, you now have to pay for your CO2 emissions. It's ramping up also to cover different types of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're starting this year with the monitoring of nitrous oxides and methane as well. And then you will also have to be surrendering the EU allowances for those gases later on down the track. So this is a big cost. Typically for a container vessel, you're looking at up to 4 million euros a year in EU allowances that you need to surrender for a vessel trading in Europe. So we're talking about big money here. So you need to have control of this. The CII performance as well, that's forming part of the charter parties. It's becoming a commercial aspect between owners and charterers. And it's also eventually impacting the commercial attractiveness, the value of the vessels in the future. So all of this means that the emission data is then critical for you to have correct, reliable, verified data to manage your business, to manage your finances. We launched a product last year to help you do that. It's called Emissions Connect. It's rather unique. There are currently no other products like it. Basically enables you to have your data managed on a continuous basis, verified, and then available for you to use towards your various stakeholders. So for example, voyage statements, they are readily available in the system. So when you conduct a voyage in and out of the EU, you can instantly create your voyage statement and ensure that the obligation for the payment of the EU allowance is transferred from the owner, who is the one responsible towards the EU for surrendering the allowance, to the charterer, who is obviously the one that needs to pay for the cost of those emissions. It's a system based on a platform that integrates with other systems and tools depending on what kind of data system you have on board your vessel. So it uses the OVD format, and it continuously verifies the data. So the important thing with this, and of course the industry does have a challenge that needs to overcome in terms of the data quality, is that it's verifying the data. And then with a class society like DNV, you're able to document that you have an independent, trustworthy verification of that data that you can use and avoid disputes with the various stakeholders. So with that, I will close, and I look forward to the panel discussion and any questions you may have later on.